Hey everyone, welcome to the C2 Smart webinar series. I'm John Patinos, a project manager here at C2 Smart. Just a heads up, this webinar, like our other webinars, will be recorded and uploaded to the C2 Smart YouTube channel. We're going to have time for some questions today, so if there's anything you'd like to ask our presenter, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I'll read them out loud at the end of the webinar. Today, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Stanislav Sobolevsky. Dr. Sobolevsky is an associate professor of practice and director of the Urban Complexity Lab at the Center for Urban Science and Progress at NYU. Dr. Sobolevsky teaches applied aspects of data science, machine learning, and network analysis, and research of his group studies human behavior in the urban context through digital traces, such as spatiotemporal big data created by social media, cell phone records, vehicle GPS traces, public service requests, credit card transactions, and other human behavior. Today's webinar is simulating the impact of ride sharing in NYC based on research sponsored by US Department of Transportation, US DOT, with support from Arcadis. Dr. Sobolevsky, please take it away.
Thank you so much, John, for a great introduction. Thanks everyone for attending. Really glad to have you here, and please allow me to introduce our project done under support of the C2 Smart Tier 1 DOT Center and Arcadis over the last year. We had a great team of CASP and Tandem graduate students, visiting researchers, and also a transportation expert from Purdue University who consulted us over the course of the project. So let's get started. Let me turn off my video for some time so that we can actually focus on the visuals, and I'll be coming back on the screen as soon as we get back to the conversational mode. So right, while understanding the impact of planned transportation solutions and interventions, which is the objective of this project, is absolutely critical for decision making, it is also challenged by complexity of the system, by the scale and complexity of the system, where everything is pretty much interconnected. And there are always multiple factors affecting every observed transformation. And this way, a holistic view is absolutely critical for making any reliable assessment. However, the data that is needed to support this holistic view is often incomplete, sometimes outdated, and in many cases inconsistent between different transportation modes of interest. The cornerstone of the impact assessment is, of course, the mode shift. So we need a simulation modeling framework for assessing the citywide mode shift. And also, once we have it, we can further translate the resulting mode shifts into the economic, environmental impacts of interest. We'll illustrate the framework on two use cases. One is introduction of ride sharing, like Uber Pool and Lyft Shared, which ultimately transformed the landscape of urban commute as we know it, maybe not as much as today's pandemics does, but also in a quite considerable way. And the other important use case is a recent introduction of Manhattan Congestion Surcharge, which is meant to partly alleviate the congestion of the downtown areas and collect some extra money to be used for improving transportation system. So the transportation planning, of course, has a lot of well-established methods for mode choice assessment, such as nested or mixed multinomial logic models, offering closed form expressions for choice probabilities. However, an individual choice simulation could be much better suited for addressing the mode shift, allowing to consistently account for individual characteristics and preferences of the travelers when simulating choices under various scenarios of interest. And this way is more suitable for the mode shift assessment, where those choices need to be transferred under changing scenarios. In addition, as mentioned, available ground truth data on the actual transportation choices needed to train the model is often incomplete or inconsistent. So the model needs to be capable of learning from such data. For example, like we have plenty of historic survey-based mainly data about commute choices. However, most of those data sets were collected in the pre-for-hire-vehicle era, and this way lack a critical piece of information, especially critical in the context of our use cases, which is for-hire-vehicle and shared for-hire-vehicle data. On the other hand, such data is provided in pretty much in almost real time. No, not real time, it's kind of year by year, but for the analytics, it's pretty much up to date by Taxi and Limousine Commission. However, the nature and scale of this data is completely inconsistent with the historic survey data, because the survey data mainly deal with repeated commute patterns such as homework commute or daily travel routines, while TLC data is about actual mobility as we see it, including all types of travels, also including residents and visitors activity, everything. So definitely those two data sets being equally important for the project are inconsistent between each other. So definitely the framework need to adequately account for such inconsistent data and be capable of dealing with them at the same time. Finally, no data set is perfect. So we need to incorporate uncertainties from both, from the data itself, like data inaccuracies, incompleteness, etc., and from the modeling, from the models we propose. And uncertainties are absolutely critical, because admitting the uncertainties leads us to admitting the fact that whatever impact we are going to end up with is not going to be accurate. So for example, if we get like a 1% reduction in travel time as a result of a certain intervention, what is the confidence interval of this impact? Is it between 0.9 and 1.1? So like the positive impact is statistically significant, or is it between -5% and +10%, which pretty much doesn't allow us even to tell whether the impact was positive or negative at a statistically significant level. So in that sense, understanding the uncertainties and statistical significance of the impacts might be even more important than understanding the average value of those impacts themselves. So the modeling framework needs to be probabilistic. It needs to be capable of incorporating all kinds of uncertainties that are present. Finally, this work is being done based on the prior research supported by Future Cities Catapult on understanding the social, economic, and environmental impacts on somewhat more local interventions such as city bike station deployments and link NYC deployments, etc. So now let's get back to the data. And the data is abundant. The project utilizes a variety of available mobility data. On one hand, those are the historic data sets on urban commute, such as, of course, census population and wage distribution, such as longitudinal employment household dynamics data, supplemented with transportation choices reported through American Community Survey, regional household travel survey, much more comprehensive and detailed, and also reflecting some occasional mobility as well. And now, thanks to C2Smart Simulation Testbed, we have a very comprehensive synthetic population with lots of details about the commuters and their routes using the actual regional household travel survey travel agendas. So we will use this data as a primary input for our model. On the other hand, as I already mentioned, those data sets lack a critical component, which is absolutely necessary for our use cases, which is for-hire vehicle data, or for-hire vehicle and shared for-hire vehicle. And on the other hand, we have very up-to-date data set provided by Taxi and Limousine Commission, reflecting taxi, for-hire vehicle, and shared for-hire vehicle ridership. We also have mobility patterns extracted from mobile data, like mobile calls or mobile app GPS, and one of those data sets is provided to us by Arcadis over the course of the project. So one of the challenges of the project will be bringing those data sets on the same scale. Another important layer of information is the characteristics of the transportation routes, which we need to assess the utility for each origin destination pair and transportation mode for further mode choice modeling. This data like travel times, travel costs, etc., are collected through Here Maps, Google Maps API, Uber API, and also driving times can be assessed based on the TLC data and some additional extrapolation to fill the data gaps. So now the central data set, as I already mentioned, the central data set for this project is the data from C2Smart simulation testbed, which provides a very comprehensive snapshot of urban commute with more than 27 million trips using synthetic population, but based on the actual regional household travel survey, travel agendas, and it provides a lot of details of the passengers, like their income group and also the routes. Since no data is perfect, in order to test the stability and data dependence of our findings, we also compare the models for using different input data on the input travel demand. And one of the data sets we use for comparison purposes is the data set provided by Arcadis based on mobile GPS tracks of more than 27 million trips, almost exact same number of trips as in C2Smart data. It also tries to infer the modality of the trips, although as we can see from this distribution plot, it doesn't look that consistent with our experience from the city. So we believe that this inference might not be that reliable. So we'll just use this data set as an input for estimating the origin destination travel demand for comparison purposes. A third data set is, of course, longitudinal employment household dynamics. And as we see from this distribution, from this comparison of distributions of trip distances, all three data sets provide their unique take on the urban commute. And C2Smart is perhaps the one having the biggest focus on the short distance trips. So we'll see how using different input data sources will affect the results of our simulation. So speaking of the simulation itself, speaking of the modeling part, it of course starts with defining the utility of each transportation mode for each choice of origin, destination, and customer characteristics. And while acknowledging that there are definitely multiple parameters responsible for people's choices, and there's definitely a scope for more comprehensive study, in this pilot, we'll focus on just two major parameters: direct cost C and the travel time T, which can be balanced using the knowing the hourly wage of the customer, W. But here we also have to acknowledge that the customers might not be perfectly rational in their assessment of the value of their time. So we also introduce the parameter beta to incorporate for this possible irrationality. Now, with that individual utility, individual perceived utility of each transportation mode by a certain customer I between origin O, destination D, using mode M, can be assessed using this objective utility U and some additional individual factor, epsilon, exponent epsilon, incorporating all the personal preferences. This factor might be multiplicative, or a more traditional setting suggests an additive factor. However, I believe the multiplicative is probably more appropriate, but we'll try different setups and pick up the one that works the best. For us, epsilon, while epsilon is, incorporates the actual individual preferences. For us, since we don't know them, the epsilon is a random factor. And again, the traditional setup of, for example, a multinomial logit model suggests generalized extreme value distribution for it, which is handy to infer the closed form expressions for resulting choice probabilities. While here, as we are not really concerned about getting such formulas, we are unconstrained in our choice of the distribution, so we can start with a normal distribution and see how it works. Also, we need to acknowledge that different transportation modes might be related. So those random factors might actually demonstrate some correlations. So they might not be independent. For example, if someone has higher preference towards taking a taxi or taking public transit, it might also be the case that the same person has a higher preference for taking a for-hire vehicle service or shared for-hire vehicle service as well. For the same, because those largely resemble the utility of the taxi that the person already seems to value. We tried different configurations of the correlation parameters, and the ones that work the best for the models while not having too many parameters and overcomplicating the model, not overcomplicating the model, and also which is consistent with our, well, basically with common sense, are the correlations across taxi for hire vehicles and shared for hire vehicles bucket, and some additional correlations between for hire vehicles and shared for hire vehicles specifically. Because if you're already a user of, for example, Uber app, you might easily choose Uber Pool instead of Uber, while if you're not using the app, you might not be choosing either of them. So now once we have if we have the parameters of the model, and the parameters for now are beta, the variance of the random terms, and also the correlation factors between them, we can simulate the individual choices, individual utilities for each transportation mode to choose, and then the choice is simply based on the highest utility or lowest cost, lowest negative utility, which can also lead us to assessing the probabilities for a given population group to choose each transportation mode. Unlike classical multinomial logit setting, in our more flexible simulation framework, we might not be able to arrive on closed form expressions for those choices, but actually it's not a big deal for us because what we care about primarily are the choice simulations, because we want to simulate the choices within the same distribution of individual preferences so that we can further compare them in different in different scenarios, such as baseline scenario or intervention scenario, while the individual preferences stay the same. So we want to have this model working on the individual scale in the first place. We still need the aggregated probabilities of mode choices for inferring, for fitting the model. However, not having closed form formulas won't be an issue because we can easily replace them with a numerical assessment. I mean, we can simulate them, of course, but simulating them for like hundreds of thousands of origin destination wage group pairs might not be computationally efficient. So we first create a random sample and then feed a neural network to the sample, basically replacing the unknown formulas for the mode choice probabilities with a fast computational scheme that is actually very accurate. We reach like almost 99-something% accuracy when we fit the 3 hidden layer network on a sample of 50,000 trips. So now once we have the aggregate probabilities of mode choice for different population groups, we can compare that with the observed ridership, if we have the ground truth for this observed ridership, and assess the likelihood of how likely is the data given the proposed model and given the parameters of the proposed model. And we can use this likelihood in the Bayesian inference framework to assess the posterior likelihood of the parameters of the model, given certain selected priors for them also. However, well, the next step is the fitting the model, of course. However, as I mentioned, we do not have the complete consistent ground truth of the citywide ridership with all the modes in place. Because yes, we can use the historic data, we can use the survey data, we can use the simulation based test bed data, which however lacks for high vehicles and shared for high vehicles. So this way we have to employ the multi-phase fit in the Bayesian inference pipeline. So first, we assess the model based on its capacity of fitting the historic data. And from that, we infer the first two parameters, beta and sigma. And again, we don't just get the max likelihood parameters, we also get the entire distribution for those with respect to the fit likelihood. Now, having this distribution, we can further simulate the model already having for high vehicles and shared for high vehicles, and compare the results with the actually observed ridership provided by Taxi and Limousine Commission. And since these, as I mentioned, the scale of those two data sets won't be consistent, we actually focus just on fitting the proportions between taxi for high vehicles and shared for high vehicles ridership. And we formulate the appropriate likelihood criteria to capture this fit. So now, with those additional simulations, we can finally get the likelihoods for all the parameters of the model, and for each of the parameter set, we can simulate the individual choices under baseline scenario and the intervention scenario. Compare them and get the mode shift corresponding, for example, to introducing shared for high vehicles, or actually we do it reverse way. So we first simulate a model with all 6 modes in place, including shared for high vehicles, and then we make shared for high vehicles disappear and look at the second choices of those individuals, what they were to choose if shared for high vehicles wouldn't be available, or what would be their choice of this individual if the Manhattan Congestion Surcharge is imposed, and this way changing the price assessment of the taxis shared for high vehicles and for high vehicles. So this gives us the mode shift, and finally, knowing the mode shift and knowing the utilities of the modes, we can translate it into economic, social, environmental impacts of interest. So now, just wrapping up the model fitting part and moving further to the to actually reporting the impact assessment for our use cases. We tried a variety of model specifications for the first phase, for the first fitting phase, with just the major transportation modes: taxi, public transit, walking, and driving, the historic setup. So of course, we tried our different setups for our simulation choice model and also compared them with traditional multinomial logit setup. Interestingly, the simulation model, the proposed simulation model demonstrates somewhat better performance on average, and also a better performance in resembling the ridership we care about the most, which is the taxi ridership, which other models seem to either underestimate or overestimate more substantially. Also, interestingly, this simulation modeling framework with multiplicative random term also provides us more reasonable assessment of the individual time rationality assessment parameter beta of 0.7, meaning around 30% of underestimation of the objective cost of the travel time, which kind of makes sense, while other models often arrive on the optimal beta parameter higher than 1, which doesn't make much sense given our understanding what beta is. So now, completing the pipeline inference framework for the simulation model allows us to simulate the mode choices in either scenario of interest for the considered use cases. In case of ride sharing, we can first simulate the choices between all 6 available modes, including shared for hire vehicles, and then assess the second choices for the population who already chosen shared for hire vehicles under the first scenario and see what they choose instead of that. This provides the mode shift assessment, where the uncertainty comes from both uncertainty in the travel time and travel cost assessments, which we can simulate in different ways within the modeling, and also uncertainty of the model parameter assessment, which we also incorporate in the framework. So as a result, we, for example, see that around 70% of the shared for hire vehicle trips would have been facilitated with other individual driving modes, meaning that in 70% of cases, shared for hire vehicle trips actually might cut the traffic by sharing rides. While in other 30% of cases, or around 25% of cases, actually they are replacing public transit. And in 4% of cases, they're replacing walking. This way, actually increasing the traffic. So the impact of shared for hire vehicles on urban traffic actually consists of 2 parts: cutting it first by ride sharing, and also involving more passengers into driving-based commute, and this way increasing the traffic. So it's interesting to see what the final balance is going to be. So speaking of the balances, we can convert those this mode shift assessment, translating it into the impacts of interest. For example, citywide travel time decrease as a result of this intervention, which is not surprising, because if you give people more options, of course they will choose the better one, the more convenient one, and often the faster one. So the overall decrease of the population-wide travel time over the city is around 1.7%, and its assessment is surprisingly robust across different possible simulations with different sets of parameters. The confidence interval for it is pretty narrow here, between 1.7 and 1.8%, which translates into around 60,000 hours saved over the course, saved by the passengers over the course of the year. Well, quite substantial if you multiply it by an average cost of the hour. So we're actually talking millions here. But it also comes at a cost. It comes at a price of citywide mileage increase. So overall, the mode shift from non-driving modes to shared for hire vehicles offsets the benefit of cutting trips. And the overall increase in miles driven is more than 1%, with also a pretty narrow confidence interval, resulting into more than 100,000 extra miles driven, adding up to traffic, which, being translated into the environmental footprint, adds around 5,000 gallons of gas consumed per year and 40 tons of CO2 emissions extra. And it also results into 70 million miles reduction for taxi traffic, which means less revenue for taxi drivers and less jobs for them, and for 14 million trips cut for the public transit, which also means a reduction in the MTA revenue. So that's speaking of the overall assessment of the ride sharing on the city scale. It incorporates the uncertainty coming from both the data accuracy and the modeling framework. However, another source of uncertainty is actually the input data. And again, this is not something we can quantify through the modeling, as the modeling is being done using one data set as an input, but we try to make experiments to see how using different data sets as a source of the original travel demand distribution influences the results. Speaking of that, between C2Smart using as an input and LHD using as an input, there is not that much discrepancy. It's almost on the border of the so confidence intervals actually almost overlap, while Arcadis data gives a slightly different assessment. And here's actually a typo. It should be, of course, minus 1.2%. So it's slightly different from the other two data sets based on the where we assess the travel demand based on mobile data, inferred from the mobile data. However, one needs to acknowledge that, of course, this inference is not perfectly accurate. So, but even from such a different data set, we still see results generally consistent with the previous assessment. Model of the typo here. So while the framework incorporates uncertainties and it provides us the cumulative impacts on the city scale commute, another important dimension to consider from the social perspective is the equitability of this impact. So which populations benefit more and which generate negative externalities? From that standpoint, the ride sharing is the most efficient for the wealthiest populations, which see the highest travel time decrease, and also which do not see such a substantial mileage increase, because their mode shift is mostly between driving modes. So they actually, for them, ride sharing actually cuts traffic. It's actually they actually share the trips more often than more low-income populations, for which most of the mode shift comes from replacing the public transit and walking now once they have another affordable transportation mode to leverage. So from that standpoint, in terms of the equitability, the impact of the intervention is most efficient for the most high-income population groups, at least for starting at the middle class level. Also, impacts are pretty heterogeneous across space. So in some areas, for example, in most areas, we see travel time decrease. However, in some areas, like, for example, JFK, we actually see a travel time increase. Interestingly, why would that be? Well, because in this case, shared for-hire vehicles actually provide a convenient transportation mode. But mostly, mostly passengers who need convenience already use taxi or for-hire vehicles. So the mode shift is primarily between taxi for-hire vehicles and shared for-hire vehicles. And this way, passengers essentially are cutting the costs. And the costs are quite substantial. I mean, the getting from JFK to somewhere actually costs a lot. So people value this money, people try to save this money, and they give up a little bit of, they're giving up the travel time, choosing somewhat slower, but much more cost-efficient mode, which is shared for hire vehicles. So in this case, based on how particular this location is, most of the mode shift actually results into travel time increase. While, of course, overall, this still comes with the perceived cost decrease for the passengers. Now, moving to the other use case, Manhattan Congestion Surcharge, we can observe an overall mileage decrease of up to 1% across different population groups. And again, the highest mileage decrease is for the more high-income population. So again, they are the ones to be affected the most. And of course, this mileage decrease, which is the primarily intention of the intervention, comes at the cost of increasing the travel times of the passengers by, again, around 1%. So we cut around 60,000 miles but add around 42,000 hours. So Manhattan Congestion Surcharge, according to our assessment, almost like mitigates 60% of the environmental footprint of shared for hire vehicles, which is kind of quite interesting to compare. Finally, we propose a visualization app, which I can showcase just right after we wrap up with the summary of the project, which allows to zoom into the results on kind of zooming into particular locations of interest, and also explore the data in general. I'll take a couple of minutes to showcase the app right after we wrap up the slides, and the app will be available through the project webpage on the C2Smart website. So finally, just recapping on the contribution of the project, the main deliverable is the framework, the modeling framework capable of incremental learning from different data sources, including both historic survey data and also the up-to-date travel information on new transportation modes. It provides the mode shift assessment resulting from different transportation interventions of interest, and will illustrate the framework on implementation of ride sharing in New York City and imposing Manhattan Congestion Surcharge. So those resulting impacts actually turn out to be rather robust in terms of all types of uncertainties we were able to quantify: data-driven uncertainty, model-driven uncertainty, and also with respect to trying different input data. They just mildly depend on the data source of mobility demand, which is probably the highest contributor to the uncertainty so far. So the main contribution is the methodology. So the use cases are rather pilots, while we definitely acknowledge that there might be much more parameters to consider to adequately capture all the details of the travel, of the passengers' behaviors. But we believe that being able to demonstrate that there is a probabilistic framework capable of robust assessment of the impacts with respect to uncertainties actually opens way for those more detailed studies if need to. And we're also looking for other applied cases to further evaluate the framework and see how it can help transportation planners, transportation consultants, and other transportation stakeholders to shape their solutions. Now, let me take just a couple of minutes to showcase the visualization app. I'll try to switch the screen sharing here. All right, so here's the app. Do you see it well?
Yeah, it looks great.
Fantastic, fantastic. So yeah, first of all, it just shows the interesting parameters distribution of the shared for hire vehicles activity normalized by the residential population, which is an important dimension here. And not surprisingly, we see that the highest fractions are, of course, in the downtown areas and the airports, all three airports here alike. It also allows us to see population density across the city. And finally, look at the impacts of interest, highlighting both areas which saw positive mileage increase and positive time increase, and negative, like time decrease. So we see that, for example, here, most areas actually have seen the time decrease as a result of the shared for hire vehicles intervention. However, some areas, including all the airports and also some areas, mostly in the outer boroughs, actually see the total travel time increase. And we can zoom into each area of interest, for example, GFK, and study and basically see the details of the impact assessments and also the the input data. So this app is interactive, and as I said, it will be posted shortly on the C2 Smart website, so you can play with it if you're interested. So now with that, let me switch back to the slide deck, and I'm happy to open it to the questions now and the discussion and inputs that might help us further shape the methodology, the project, and probably further use cases for it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sobolevsky. That was great. So we actually have a question right away from someone in the audience. Have you looked at modal shift as a result of the current pandemic?
Oh yeah, that would be a great development for the project. We're definitely looking forward to that. And right now, basically based on our last discussion with Arcadis, that would be actually one of the priorities, and we are looking for jointly with them. We are looking for a possibility to frame a project about that. Another important dimension that many transportation authorities are interested right now is what would happen if we offer free transit service. How this will shape the travel demand, especially in the currently changed conditions. So I know many transportation authorities actually look into that, and we're looking for the way to continue the project from that perspective.
Okay. What would the next logical steps be for improving the accuracy of this framework?
Well, definitely there are multiple avenues. So on one hand, we can look at getting more accurate data. As we saw, the biggest source of uncertainty is the data set itself. So while within the same data set, uncertainty is rather mild, between the different data sets, between the different input data sets, uncertainty might be more substantial. So definitely it's a hunt for better data. That's one dimension. The other possible way of improving is looking at more aspects of individual behaviors that affect the way people make decisions about which transportation modes to choose. Right now, it's just time and cost. While definitely we assume that there might be also some convenience parameters. For example, taxi and private driving are more convenient than public transit, and introducing such convenience factor might also be a great contribution to the modeling framework. Finally, right now, the way we infer the model, we infer the parameters of the model is based on the Monte Carlo Bayesian simulation. So we managed to perform like around 10,000 simulations, which is a lot. However, while we have multiple parameters at the same time, of course, the inference framework can benefit from more simulations. So involving high performance clusters, we can scale that to millions of parameter set being considered. Again, here we were mostly concerned about delivering like a viable pilot, showing that this framework can lead to a robust impact assessment, which won't be like wildly different from one run of the model to the other. And on that end, I think we succeeded. However, further improving accuracy of the framework can involve all sorts of things: data, more computational power, and more parameters of individual behavior to consider.
So you brought up data sets. What kinds of data would you like to see being collected at the agency level to improve this kind of simulation project?
Well, primarily, I would say that's the data on the actual daily mobility behavior, not just the major like commute patterns like homework commute. On that end, I guess we're good. Although this data might need to be updated. Right now, it's from early 10s. It would be great to collect it on a more time granular basis. Plus, data about actual like routine mobility of both residents and visitors to the city. That's also an important dimension, because New York City at least has been a vibrant city before the pandemics, and we hope that it will get back to its historic shape, and we hope it will happen soon, sooner rather than later. So in this setting, at least, I would say a substantial part, maybe even half of the mobility happening in the city is based on the behavior of city visitors. And that's missing from most of the travel data available so far. So that's an important aspect for the data collection that needs to be addressed.
Okay, I have a whole bunch of questions from a participant here. This person says they missed a few slides in the beginning. Is this microscopic simulation or numerical simulation?
Well, it's a numerical simulation, but it is done at a pretty microscopic level of individual commuter behaviors. So for each commuter, like commuting from a given origin to a given destination of a given wage group, we simulate her individual preferences to each of the considered transportation modes and choose the mode that fits the best.
Do you have access to more detailed results, for example, at this, like a street level analysis or zone within the zone dynamics?
Yeah, a street level would be great. And actually, that's one of the ways to improve the model. Right now, it's the modeling is being done at the aggregated scale of the taxi zone origins and destinations. While of course it can benefit from more granular origin destination definition. I don't think it will be that more difficult. It's just a matter of data availability at this scale, because unfortunately TLC data is before it was provided on the latitude longitude level, so we had exact location of pickup and drop off. Now unfortunately we only have the location of up to the taxi zone level. So again, this is, by the way, one of the items on our wish list for the data collection.
Okay, and then finally, at least in terms of this question, have you done, or maybe have you considered normalization in the analysis, considering different sizes of zones? So like the largeness or smallness of certain zones, or normalization based on population or income or any other sort of like magnitude variable?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, the data, first of all, we do consider normalization based on the magnitude of the input data, because we acknowledge the fact that the input data doesn't cover the entire city, the entire urban mobility. So basically we use the input data more as like a like spatial distribution of origin destination mobility demand, while the actual impacts are assessed based on the scale of the actual TLC data, based on the actually observed shared for hire vehicle, and taxi ridership. So that's one part of the normalization. Speaking of the zones, yeah, of course, I mean, different origin destination pairs contribute differently to the likelihood assessment as long as the inference of the model is concerned. So basically it all comes down to having equal weights for each individual simulation. And if, for example, for one origin destination pair, you have 1,000 individual trips, and for others, we have 100 individual trips, they contribute differently to the final likelihood assessment.
Okay. So can you talk a little more about your choice to deal predominantly with ride sharing as opposed to ride hailing?
Ride sharing as opposed to what?
Ride hailing in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, definitely, there were like two motivations. One was historic, because that was basically that was on the wish list of our first project we were doing with Future Cities Catapult. So we were not able to address it back then. But once we saw that the data on shared for hire vehicles is now available from TLC, so it was not the case from the beginning. Originally, only just the for hire vehicles as a bulk were in bulk were provided, but there was no like flag of whether it was a shared ride or not, which was added starting in 2017. So as soon as we've seen that now this data is available, we decided that basically that's the assessment that we now can make. So in this case, it was just dictated by the data availability. So if we can have equally useful data for the ride hailing, we can certainly repeat the analysis again and again. The primary objective of the project was the methodological, to show that there is a way, despite all the heterogeneities, inconsistencies, despite the missing data, despite the imperfections of the input data, we can still have a robust probabilistic simulation modeling that will be able to arrive on statistically significant impacts. So that was the kind of the biggest promise of the project. While the use cases were rather secondary, and they were motivated by both, by like practical interest, and of course, I mean, I admit that shared for hire vehicles, they're already out there for like more than 5 years. So it's more of like academic and historic interest, right? While new modes like micromobility, for example, or like shared on-demand shuttles, etc., they might be more of a practical significance while considering new transportation interventions. So on one hand, on practical significance side, there might be more interesting assessments actually. But on the methodological side, we were quite intrigued by the challenge of the scale of the impact. So shared for hire vehicles definitely led to a citywide impact of the worst scale. So we wanted to see if we can capture that.
So thank you for sharing this extremely interesting project with us. I was wondering, I guess, what comes next for this project or for your research?
Well, definitely we're looking for more applied cases of practical significance. And that's actually the purpose of our outreach to different transportation companies and stakeholders. And of course, Arcadis is our primary partner, but we're looking for more. So any leads, any suggestions, any anything that any connections that anyone might share would be highly appreciated. And also like any suggestions on the methodological improvements as we currently work on bringing this. Right now we have a preprint which will be out on archive shortly, but we're also working towards the academic publication. So in the meantime, any suggestions on improving the methodological side of things would be also highly valued. So we're looking forward to that. I'm really thankful for all of you joining, and it was a great discussion. I enjoyed. So, and if any of you would like to continue it offline, please feel free to reach out, and I'll be more than happy to talk.
Yeah, we can send some follow-up information after this. I thought it might be interesting. I'm sure there are several ride-sharing companies that would like to see kind of like any sort of positive economic impact you might find in form of like increases to tax revenue or some sort of positive labor force impact. Maybe people moving to driving for ride sharing instead of
totally. And there is positive impact in that. For the population, impact was positive. So the time is saved, a lot of money is saved if you convert time to money. So yes, and also we know that now, thanks to ride sharing, many areas of the city become more livable, more accessible, and more vibrant thanks to that. Of course, I mean, we probably have to revisit that after pandemics, because now everything just was turned upside down. But it might be interesting to see how ride sharing actually helps, helps the neighborhoods recover their vibrancy. And I'm pretty sure that it will play a critical role on that side.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sobolevsky. To everyone who joined, thanks for participating. Thanks for your great questions. You can check out this webinar and all of our other webinars and recorded seminars on the C2 Smart YouTube channel. And you can also follow us on our Twitter account at C2 Smart NYU. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much.